the late spring of 1888, the sun over the Nebraska Territory was not a friend. It was a tyrant. It beat down on the plains with a physical weight, bleaching the grasses to the color of old bone and baking the rich soil into a cracked gray plate. The sky was a vast, empty canvas of pale, shimmering blue, offering no promise of relief, no hint of a cloud. For the settlers of Prairie Ridge, this was the beginning of their annual siege. A siege not of men or armies, but of heat. A relentless, suffocating enemy that crept through the chinks in their log cabins, that radiated from the very ground they walked on, and that stole the life from their crops and the strength from their bodies. They knew the enemy was coming. They prepared for it in the ways their fathers had, and their fathers before them. They whitewashed their south-facing walls, hoping to reflect the worst of the glare. They hung heavy quilts over their windows, plunging their homes into a stuffy, semi-darkness that did little to stop the oppressive warmth. They dug their root cellars a foot deeper, chasing the cool of the deep earth, only to find the heat followed them down. Every year was the same. A battle of attrition fought with wet rags and shallow pails of well water. A battle they always lost. But that year, one man was doing something different. Something strange. Something that the people of Prairie Ridge could only describe as pure foolishness. His name was Josiah. He was a quiet man, an outsider who had arrived 2 years prior with his wife Sarah and a set of skills that seemed ill-suited to the vast, dry plains. He had the steady hands of a carpenter, but the distant gaze of a sailor, a man more accustomed to the roll of a deck than the flatness of the horizon. And he was building a second house. Or at least, that is what it looked like. On the north side of his small, sturdy cabin, where the sun's punishing rays never fell, a new structure was rising. It was a bizarre, windowless shed, a hulking rectangle of raw lumber. But it was the walls that drew the stares and stoked the gossip. They were impossibly thick, nearly 2 feet from inside to out, a double frame of studs creating a vast, hollow cavity. And into this cavity, Josiah was packing sawdust. Hour after hour, he would haul wagon loads of the fine, fragrant dust from the local sawmill, waste material that everyone else used for tinder or simply burned, and tamp it down into the walls with a long pole. He was building a house of wood dust. The work was slow, methodical, and utterly baffling to his neighbors. They watched him from the road, their wagons paused, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. He was wasting good lumber. He was inviting termites, damp, and rot. He was, in the blunt assessment of the town's leading carpenter, building a monument to his own ignorance. But Josiah didn't seem to notice their stares or hear their whispers. He just worked, his face set in a mask of quiet concentration, as he constructed this strange, sawdust-filled box against the side of his home. This oddity was becoming the talk of the settlement. Why was he building a second house around his house? What could possibly be the purpose of a thick-walled, windowless shed filled with sawmill trash? The people of Prairie Ridge didn't know the answer, but they knew one thing for certain. When the brutal, killing heat of the Nebraska summer finally arrived, Josiah and his family would bake in that cabin, suffocated by his own bizarre creation. They were sure of it. They were building their homes to breathe, to catch any whisper of a breeze. He was building a tomb. He was building a tomb, and they whispered among themselves that the man had surely gone mad. The man had surely gone mad. That was the consensus. If you were already intrigued by this forgotten piece of frontier engineering, a story of how one man's supposed madness was actually a stroke of unheralded genius, do me a favor and hit that like button. And make sure you are subscribed, because the principle he was about to unleash on the unsuspecting prairie is as relevant today as it was in 1888? Let me know in the comments. What is the hottest summer you have ever had to endure? What did you do to fight it? Think about that, because what Josiah was building was not just a curiosity. It was a machine. A passive cooling engine that would rewrite the rules of survival in this brutal landscape. And the science behind it is as brilliant today as it was then. To understand what Josiah was doing, you have to understand where he came from. He was not a man of the plains. He was born and raised in the crisp, cold air of Maine, in a small town clinging to the banks of the mighty Kennebec River. His childhood was not marked by the rhythm of planting and harvesting, but by the groan of ice saws and the thunder of massive crystal blocks sliding down wooden chutes. He had come of age during the golden era of America's ice trade, a time when frozen water from New England was a precious commodity shipped to the wealthiest homes in Charleston, the finest hotels in New York City, and even as far as the sweltering ports of India. Josiah had not been a simple laborer, hacking at the frozen river with a pike pole. His father had arranged for him an apprenticeship with a man named Mr. Abernathy, an engineer who designed and built the colossal ice houses that lined the riverbank. These were not mere barns. They were cathedrals of cold, some of them covering acres of land, capable of storing tens of thousands of tons of winter's harvest through the hottest summers, preserving it for its long journey south. It was here, in the cool, fragrant darkness of these structures, that Josiah learned the secrets that the farmers of Prairie Ridge could not even begin to comprehend. He learned that cold was not simply the absence of heat. He learned to think of cold as a tangible resource, a thing to be harvested, managed, and deployed with precision. Mr. Abernathy taught him that heat was a relentless enemy, always seeking to invade, but that it could be slowed. It could be fought. He learned about insulation, not as a vague concept, but as a calculated science. He learned the value of trapped air, the incredible thermal resistance of a foot of sawdust, of wood shavings, of straw. He learned that a wall's thickness was its strength, its armor against the sun. He learned that the greatest ally in preserving the cold was the earth itself, the constant, stable temperature that lay just a few feet beneath the soil. He also learned about the enemy within, the melt. He studied how to stack the massive 300-pound blocks of ice not as a solid mass, but with strategic layers of straw or wood shavings in between. This prevented the blocks from fusing together and, more importantly, created channels for air to circulate and for the inevitable meltwater to drain away harmlessly. An ice house that flooded itself from the inside was a failure. A well-designed one would manage its own decline, sacrificing its mass slowly, grudgingly, over many months. He had spent his youth building structures designed to do one thing: to stand in the face of the summer sun and say, no. To keep winter locked in a box. When he and Sarah moved west, seeking land of their own, he brought that knowledge with him, folded away in his mind like a set of blueprints. And as he experienced his first 2 Nebraska summers, he saw the problem with a clarity his neighbors lacked. They saw the heat as an unavoidable fact of life, a form of suffering to be endured. He saw it as a straightforward engineering problem. Their cabins were the enemy. The standard frontier cabin was a thermal disaster. It was a single-walled structure of logs, with gaps chinked with mud and grass. It was designed to be built quickly and to keep the winter wind out. But it had no defense against radiant heat. The sun would beat upon the roof and the south and west walls, and that heat would transfer directly through the wood, turning the interior into an oven. The air inside would become hot, stagnant, and oppressive. By midday, the temperature inside a cabin could be 10 or even 15 degrees hotter than the air outside. They were solar cookers. The settlers' attempts to fight back were futile. Hanging a wet sheet in a doorway provided a brief moment of evaporative cooling, But in the dry prairie air, the sheet was bone dry in 20 minutes, and the effort only added humidity to the already stifling air. A porch offered shade, yes, but it did nothing to cool the air itself. It was like seeking refuge from a fire by hiding in its shadow. The heat remained all around. The consequences were more than just discomfort. Food spoiled with alarming speed. A pail of milk, fresh from the cow in the morning, would be sour by noon. Butter would turn to a rancid oil. Meat that was not heavily salted or smoked would be crawling with maggots within a day. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a threat to their food security, to the precious stores that had to last them through the year. The heat also took a direct toll on their health. Heat exhaustion was common, a debilitating condition that left a person weak, dizzy, and unable to work. For the very young and the elderly, it could be fatal. The relentless oppressive heat frayed nerves, shortened tempers, and cast a pall of weary misery over the entire community for months on end. Josiah saw all of this not with judgment, but with the analytical eye of an engineer. The problem was not the sun. The sun was a constant. The problem was the design of their homes. They were fighting a defensive battle on all fronts, and losing. He knew he needed to go on the attack. He needed a source of cold, a reservoir of it. And on the prairie, that meant harvesting it in the winter and storing it for the summer. This was the genesis of his strange, sawdust-filled shed. It was not a second house. It was an ice house, built according to the principles Mr. Abernathy had taught him on the banks of the Kennebec. The construction, which so baffled his neighbors, was a meticulous application of that forgotten science. He began by digging, not deep, but wide, creating a shallow pit about 3 feet deep on the north side of his cabin. This was critical. The north side was in perpetual shadow, shielded from the sun by the cabin itself. He lined the bottom of this pit with a thick layer of field stones, creating a stable base that would also allow for drainage. This was his first layer of defense, ground coupling. By nesting the heart of his structure in the earth, he was tying it to the planet's immense thermal stability. The ground a few feet down remains at a near constant temperature year-round, a cool 55 degrees in this region. It would be a constant, gentle drain, pulling heat away from his ice store. Then came the walls. The double-stud frame was a revelation. While his neighbors were painstakingly fitting single logs together, Josiah built a skeleton. 2 parallel walls, separated by a full 20 inches of open space. This was his armor. Into that space went the sawdust. He chose it for a simple reason Abernathy had taught him. It was cheap, it was plentiful, and it was a magnificent insulator. The millions of tiny wood particles trapped countless microscopic pockets of air. And still, air is one of the best insulators there is. Heat struggles to move through it. The 20-inch thick layer of densely packed sawdust gave his ice house an insulating value that was likely 50 times greater than the log walls of his neighbors' cabins. It was like building a fortress with walls made of winter coats. The roof was built on the same principle. A deep, sawdust-packed attic that would rebuff the heat that tried to beat down from above. He sheathed the entire exterior in rough-sawn pine boards, and the interior as well, creating a sealed, robust box. There were no windows to let in the sun's light and heat. There was only one door on the east side, and it was built like a vault door. 3 layers of wood with insulating paper between them, fitted so tightly into its frame that not a sliver of light could pass through. Inside this insulated sanctum, he had prepared his weapon. The previous winter, while his neighbors were huddled by their fires, Josiah had been at the frozen river with his saw. He had harvested nearly 100 blocks of ice, each a yard square and a foot thick, clear and solid. He'd hauled them back to his homestead on a sledge, and, in the brutal cold of January, had carefully stacked them inside his nearly finished structure. He stacked them just as he had been taught, not as a solid cube, but as an engineered monolith. A layer of insulating straw on the stone floor, then the first layer of ice blocks with small gaps between them. Then another layer of straw, and another layer of ice. The stack rose 12 feet high, a shimmering blue core at the heart of his sawdust fortress. But all of this, the insulation, the ground coupling, the careful stacking, was just the storage system. It was the second part of his design that elevated it from a simple ice shed to a work of genius. He had not built the ice house as a separate building. He had built it directly against the north wall of his family's living quarters. And in that shared wall, he had cut two small, precise openings. One was low to the floor, just 6 inches from the ground, measuring about a foot square. The other was its twin, but positioned high up on the wall, just 6 inches from the ceiling. Each opening was fitted with a small, sliding door, like a tiny hatch, that could be opened or closed from inside the cabin. This was the engine. This was the heart of his passive cooling machine. He was not just storing cold, he was planning to circulate it. It was a system built on one of the most fundamental principles of physics, convection. He knew that cold air is denser and heavier than warm air. The air inside the ice house, in direct contact with the massive stack of frozen water, would become intensely cold and heavy. It would sink, pooling at the bottom of the structure around the lower vent. The air inside his cabin, heated by the day and the simple presence of his family, would be warmer and lighter. When he opened both vents, a silent, invisible process would begin. The heavy, cold air from the bottom of the ice house would spill out of the lower vent and into the cabin, flowing across the floor like a slow, invisible river. This influx of cold air would displace the warmer, lighter air in the cabin. And where would that warm air go? It would rise. It would be pushed upward, toward the ceiling, where it would find its own escape route, the upper vent. It would be drawn out of the cabin and into the top of the ice house. There it would come into contact with the cold, melting ice, release its heat, and become cold and dense itself. It would then sink to the bottom, ready to flow back into the cabin through the lower vent. He had created a closed loop, a self-perpetuating, silent, and continuous circle of air. A thermal siphon. It required no fuel, no power, no moving parts. It was powered by the simple, inexorable laws of physics. It was a gravity-driven air conditioner. This was the secret that Josiah held in his mind while his neighbors shook their heads and muttered about his foolishness. He was not building a tomb. He was building a climate. And the residents of Prairie Ridge were about to learn a lesson in humility. The gossip started as a low murmur in the general store and grew into a confident chorus by the time the first real heat of June arrived. Josiah's Folly, they called it. The name was coined by a farmer named Jedediah Smith, a man whose opinions were as loud as his laugh, and it stuck immediately. It was perfect. It captured the sheer, pig-headed strangeness of the project. Men would lean on the counter of the store, chewing on straw, and offer their predictions. The first big rain, that sawdust will turn to a wet mush. The whole wall will slump. He'll have mushrooms growing out of his floorboards by August. My money's on termites. They'll eat that fool thing from the inside out and then start on his cabin. The mockery wasn't always malicious. Some of it was born of genuine, if misguided, concern. But it was constant. When Sarah went to town for supplies, conversations would halt. Women would offer her sympathetic glances, their eyes filled with pity for this poor woman married to a madman. The children were less subtle. They would run past the homestead, yelling, "Josiah's Folly!" before sprinting away, giggling. It became a local landmark, a point of perverse community pride. It was the strangest thing anyone had ever seen, and everyone had an opinion on it. The loudest and most respected of these opinions belonged to Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the closest thing Prairie Ridge had to an expert. He was a master carpenter who had come from Ohio, a man who had built more than half the homes, the church, and the town hall. He was a man who believed in plumb lines, square joints, and the proven wisdom of generations. He built solid, honest structures that could withstand the winter gales and the summer sun. He dealt in the practical, the tangible, the known. And he saw Josiah's creation as a personal affront to his craft. He did not confine his criticisms to the general store. He made his pronouncements publicly, with the unshakable confidence of a man who knows he is right. "That structure is a death trap," he declared one afternoon to a small crowd that had gathered as he repaired a wagon wheel. "He's sealed it up tight. There's no ventilation. He's breathing the same stale air over and over. That's how you get lung fever." On another occasion, he pointed a stern finger at the ice house itself. "He's invited the damp right up against his house. The north wall of that cabin will be rotten inside of 3 years. The sills will go first, then the floor joists. He's actively destroying his own home. It's a textbook example of what not to do." Marcus saw the double wall not as a clever design, but as a wasteful, ignorant extravagance. All that extra lumber, all that effort. For what? To build a home for rats and sowbugs in a pile of wet sawdust. He could have built a fine smokehouse with those materials. Instead, he built that. To Marcus, it was a violation of the frontier ethos. You used what you needed, you built what was proven to work, and you did not indulge in flights of fancy. Josiah's work was a flight of fancy, and a dangerous one at that. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that Josiah was not just a fool, but a hazard to his family. This constant barrage of criticism and ridicule took its toll, not on Josiah, but on Sarah. She was a strong woman, as anyone who survived on the prairie had to be, but she was not immune to the pressure of the community. The averted eyes, the sudden silences, the thinly veiled pity. It was a heavy burden to bear. She trusted her husband. She had seen the quiet confidence with which he worked, the deep knowledge that seemed to guide his hands. But doubt is a seed that can grow in even the most fertile soil of faith. One evening, as Josiah sat by the lamp, sharpening the blade of a hand plane, she finally gave voice to her fears. "Josiah," she began, her voice soft. "Mr. Thorne was in the store today. He was telling everyone. He said the walls will rot. He said the damp will get into the cabin. He made it sound so certain." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for an assurance that was more than just a feeling. "Are you sure, Josiah? Are you truly sure this will work?" She wasn't questioning his skill, but the very foundation of his idea. An idea that ran contrary to everything everyone else in their world believed to be true. Josiah set down his plane and looked at her. He did not offer a grand defense or a complex explanation. He simply reached out and took her hand. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm and even. "On the Kennebec, we stored 10,000 tons of ice in a shed 4 times this size. We kept it frozen clear through to September. The walls didn't rot, the sills held. It's the same principle, just smaller." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "Trust the principle. And trust me." He showed no such patience for the public criticism. He simply ignored it. One day, Marcus Thorne saw Josiah on the road to town and decided to confront him directly, expert to fool. He strode up to Josiah's wagon, blocking its path. "Josiah," he said, his voice firm and loud, for he knew others were watching. "I feel it's my duty to tell you that what you've built is a grave mistake. You are putting your family's health and home at risk. When that ice melts, you will have a quagmire, and the rot will set in before winter. I urge you, for your wife's sake, to tear it down before it's too late. Josiah sat on his wagon seat, the reins held loosely in his hands. He looked at Marcus, his expression unreadable. He didn't argue. He didn't offer a defense. He didn't explain the principles of thermal convection or the insulating properties of sawdust. He simply met the master carpenter's gaze and nodded slowly. "I hear you, Marcus," he said. And that was all. He clucked to his horse and drove the wagon around the indignant carpenter, leaving him standing in a cloud of dust. Josiah's resolve was not loud, it was deep. He had no need to win arguments with words. The summer was coming. The heat would be the judge. And he was content to wait for its verdict. The summer arrived not as a guest, but as an invader. June was hot and dusty, a prelude. July was a furnace, a relentless month-long assault that left the land gasping. The sun, which rose as a fiery red orb, would climb the sky and transform into a brass sun, a white-hot disk hanging in a hazy, colorless sky. The air itself seemed to have weight, a physical presence that made every breath a conscious effort. The cicadas sang a monotonous, high-pitched song of heat from dawn till dusk, a sound that drilled into the skull and frayed the nerves. Then, in the first week of August, the real trial began. A telegraph message came down the line, a stark warning passed from station to station across the plains. A great dome of high pressure had stalled over the central continent. The air was stagnant, sinking, and compressing, heating itself as it fell. The forecast was not for a hot day or two, but for a period of unprecedented, sustained, and dangerous heat. The great searing of 1888 had begun. The temperature climbed. It passed 95, then 100. Then it hit 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and it stayed there for a day, then 2, then a week. Prairie Ridge began to break. The veneer of civilization, so carefully constructed, started to crack under the strain. The heat was a physical torment. Door handles were too hot to touch. Tools left in the sun would raise blisters on the skin. The river slowed to a murky, tepid crawl. The wells, which had been a source of cool, life-giving water, began to draw up water that was lukewarm and tasted of mud as the water table dropped. The corn in the fields, once green and promising, turned yellow, its leaves curling in on themselves in a final, futile effort to conserve moisture. Life inside the cabins was a living hell. The structures, built by Marcus Thorne, so sturdy and well-crafted, became inescapable traps. The heat they absorbed during the day radiated back into the rooms all night long, offering no relief. Sleep was impossible. Families would drag their mattresses outside, hoping to catch a breeze that never came, only to be driven back inside by mosquitoes and the oppressive, radiant heat coming off the ground itself. Wet sheets dried in minutes. Children were listless and crying, their skin flushed and hot to the touch. The town doctor was overwhelmed with cases of sunstroke and heat exhaustion. Food stores were devastated. The milk soured before the cream could even rise. Smoked hams, hung from the rafters, began to drip and spoil in the suffocating warmth. The precious jars of canned vegetables from the previous year's harvest began to pop their seals as bacteria flourished in the heat, rendering them useless. Tempers, already worn thin by weeks of heat, now snapped. Arguments broke out over the dwindling supply of well water. The blacksmith's forge was cold. It was simply too hot to work. The general store was a place of grim, silent transactions. The community was being slowly, methodically cooked. But on Josiah's homestead, a different reality was unfolding. While the rest of Prairie Ridge suffered in the sweltering heat, the inside of Josiah's cabin was an oasis of cool, calm air. It was not the biting, artificial cold of a modern machine. It was the deep, natural coolness of a forest floor, of a stone cellar. The air was dry and still, holding a steady, comfortable 68 degrees. He had opened the two small vents in the wall, and his silent engine had whirred to life. The invisible river of cold air was flowing into their home. Life continued with a serene normalcy that would have seemed like a fever dream to their neighbors. Sarah was able to churn butter, the paddle firming up the cream into a solid, sweet block. She could bake bread in her small stove without turning the cabin into a sauna, as the excess heat was simply drawn out through the upper vent. Their young son, Caleb, who in any other home would have been miserable and fretful, played happily on the wooden floor, cool and content. At night, they slept soundly under a single light blanket, the oppressive heat of the world held at bay by 20 inches of sawdust and a stack of melting ice. Josiah managed his system with the careful precision of an engineer monitoring his machine. Each morning, he would briefly enter the ice house to inspect the stack. It was melting, of course. A small, steady trickle of pure, cold water flowed from the base of the stack and was channeled away by the trench he had dug outside. But the melt was slow, controlled. The monolith of ice was sacrificing itself, its mass of stored winter cold being steadily converted into his family's comfort and safety. He estimated he was losing less than 2% of the total ice mass each day. His resource was holding. His folly was working. The climax of the ordeal came for Marcus Thorne. His own wife, Eleanor, had fallen ill. She was weak, dizzy, and her skin was frighteningly hot and dry. The doctor had come and gone, offering little more than advice to keep her cool and hydrated, an impossible task. The water from their well was warm, and every room in their masterfully built house felt like the inside of a furnace. Marcus was a proud man, but he was also a desperate husband. He had seen Josiah's homestead from the road. He had noted, with a flicker of grudging curiosity, the lack of desperate activity, the absence of wet sheets hanging in the windows. He didn't understand it, but in his desperation, he was willing to seek any port in a storm. He set out for Josiah's homestead in the crushing heat of the late afternoon. The sun was a physical blow. The 200-yard walk left him breathless and sweating, his shirt soaked through, his head pounding. He felt a wave of dizziness as he approached the small cabin. He was steeling himself to swallow his pride, to ask for— he wasn't even sure. A bucket of cooler water, perhaps? Some advice? Anything. He raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door. After a moment, the door swung open, and Josiah stood before him. And then it happened. A wave of air, dense, cool, and utterly astonishing, washed over Marcus. It was not a breeze, it was a physical presence. It was like stepping out of a desert and into a mountain cave. The shock of it made him stagger back a step. The air that spilled from the cabin was 35 degrees cooler than the air he was breathing. It was a miracle. He stared, speechless, past Josiah into the cabin's interior. He saw the impossible. He saw Sarah sitting in a rocking chair, calmly knitting. He saw the boy, Caleb, building a small tower of wooden blocks on the floor. The light inside was calm, the scene one of perfect domestic peace. There was no sign of the suffering that had gripped every other home in the valley. There was only comfort. The reality of what he was seeing, the undeniable proof of his own catastrophic error in judgment, struck him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at Josiah, his face a mask of disbelief and awe. The master builder, the expert, the voice of conventional wisdom, could only manage to stammer a single humbled word. How? How? That one word hung in the cool air between them, a surrender and a plea all at once. Josiah didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He simply stepped aside and gestured for Marcus to come in out of the oppressive heat. The transition from the world outside to the world inside Josiah's cabin was a profound physical shock. For Marcus, it was like diving into a cool lake on a blistering day. The relief was immediate and overwhelming. As his body cooled, his mind began to race, trying to process the impossible reality around him, Josiah explained. He didn't use fancy terms or complex theories. He spoke in the simple, practical language of a builder. He showed Marcus the two vents. He explained how the cold, heavy air from the ice house sank and flowed into the room, while the warmer, lighter air was pushed out. He took him outside and showed him the thick, sawdust-packed walls. He explained how the insulation was not meant to keep the cabin warm in winter, but to keep the ice house cold in summer. He made it all sound simple, inescapably logical. Marcus listened, his face a mixture of shame and burgeoning excitement. He was not just seeing a clever trick, he was witnessing the birth of a new kind of wisdom. When the great heat wave finally broke, replaced by a week of blessed, cooling rain, the story of Josiah's cool cabins spread like wildfire. But Josiah knew that stories were not enough. He needed data. He owned a thermometer, a rare and precious instrument on the frontier, brought with him from the East. He proposed to Marcus that they take formal measurements to quantify the difference, to replace gossip with facts. A humbled and eager Marcus Thorne readily agreed. They became an unlikely pair of scientific investigators. They went first to Marcus's own home, the one he had always considered the pinnacle of frontier construction. At 2 p.m, the hottest part of the day, the thermometer on his porch read 92 degrees. Inside the main room, with the windows shuttered, the mercury climbed to a stifling 101. It was hotter inside than out. Then they walked to Josiah's homestead. The same thermometer on his porch, in the shade, read 92 degrees. They stepped inside. Josiah placed the thermometer on the table in the center of the room. They watched in silence as the thin red line of alcohol began to fall. It slid past 80, past 70. It came to a rest at a steady, unbelievable 67 degrees. A difference of 34 degrees. Marcus recorded the numbers in a small leather-bound ledger with a carpenter's pencil, his hand steady. The simple act of writing the figures down felt momentous, a final, irrefutable validation. They continued their audit. They went into the ice house. The air was frigid, hovering just above freezing. The great stack of ice was still immense. Josiah measured the remaining blocks. By his calculations, he had used just under 30% of his winter's harvest to defeat the most brutal heat wave in the territory's recorded history. He had enough ice remaining to last through 2 more heat waves just as severe. The data was clear, stark, and undeniable. It wasn't magic. It was engineering. It wasn't folly. It was a resounding success. The numbers in Marcus Thorne's ledger represented more than just temperature. They represented a paradigm shift. The following Sunday, after the church service, the community gathered outside as they always did, sharing news and trading gossip. Marcus Thorne, a man whose voice carried the weight of authority, cleared his throat and stood on the church steps. A hush fell over the small crowd. They expected him to talk about repairs to the town well or the organization of a new barn raising. They were wrong. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice clear and strong. "I have something I need to say. For months, many of us, and myself most loudly, have been talking about Josiah's new building. We had a name for it. We called it Josiah's Folly." He paused, letting the words hang in the air, letting the memory of their collective mockery settle upon them. "I am here today to tell you that I was wrong. We were all wrong. I was the fool. A murmur went through the crowd. Marcus held up a hand for silence. During the worst of the heat, when my own family was sick and suffering, in a house I built with my own hands, Josiah's family was living in comfort. I have seen it. I have felt it. I have measured it. His home was 34 degrees cooler than mine. He didn't build a house for winter. He built a house for summer. He didn't build a monument to foolishness. He built a machine that runs on sawdust and ice, and it showed us all a better way to live in this land. He brought wisdom from his past, and he did not bow to our ignorance. He just kept working. I, for one, am grateful for his stubbornness, and I intend to learn from it. That public admission, that unreserved recantation from the community's most respected expert, was the turning point. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a wave of curiosity and respect. Suddenly, Josiah was not the town eccentric, he was the town genius. Men who had once laughed at him now approached him with their hats in their hands, asking questions, seeking to understand. Josiah, ever patient, explained the principles to anyone who would listen. He drew diagrams in the dirt, explaining insulation, convection, and the critical importance of the northern exposure. That winter, the sound of saws on the frozen river was louder than ever before. But the ice was not being harvested for shipment to some distant city. It was for Prairie Ridge. Guided by the newfound partnership of Josiah's innovative knowledge and Marcus Thorne's practical building skills, a revolution in local architecture began. All through the spring, new structures rose on the north sides of cabins throughout the valley. They were not all identical to Josiah's original. Some were smaller. Some used straw for insulation instead of sawdust. But they all followed the same core principles. The Prairie Ridge Cooler, as it came to be known, was born. The long-term impact on the community was profound. The following summer was hot, but the suffering was gone. Families could rest and recover from their hard work in cool, comfortable homes. Food spoilage plummeted. With the ability to keep milk, butter, and meat fresh for days, nutrition and health improved across the board. The most vulnerable, the infants and the elderly, were no longer at the mercy of the brutal heat. The coolers allowed for a new level of productivity. A farmer could work in the fields during the cooler morning hours, rest and eat in the comfort of his home during the midday inferno, and then return to work in the late afternoon. The entire rhythm of life shifted, becoming more sustainable, more resilient. The idea spread. Travelers passing through Prairie Ridge saw the strange windowless sheds and inquired about them. The principles were so simple, so effective, and so easily replicated using local materials that the design was copied and adapted across the territory. The story of Josiah's folly became a piece of local legend, a tale told to newcomers about the quiet man who taught everyone that the solution to the summer's greatest threat was to embrace the winter's greatest gift. His innovation was a direct ancestor to the principles of modern building science. His sawdust-packed walls were a primitive form of the super-insulated walls found in today's high-efficiency homes. His silent, gravity-powered convection loop was the forerunner of passive cooling and natural ventilation systems that architects now celebrate as cutting-edge green design. He had created more than just a cool room. He had created a legacy of sustainable, intelligent living, proving that sometimes the most profound innovations come not from looking forward, but from remembering the simple, powerful truths that we have forgotten. The story of Josiah and his ice house is not just about a clever way to stay cool. It is a powerful lesson about the nature of wisdom and the danger of conventional thinking. The people of Prairie Ridge were not foolish. They were simply trapped by their own experience. They knew how to build a cabin that worked, and they could not imagine a different way. True innovation, the kind that changes everything, often looks like madness to those who are comfortably settled in the status quo. It requires a person to step outside of accepted wisdom, to look at a problem from a completely new angle, and to have the courage to withstand ridicule and doubt. Josiah's genius was not just in understanding the physics of heat and cold. It was in his quiet determination, his unwavering trust in the principles he knew to be true, and his humility in letting the results speak for themselves. It is a timeless reminder that the most elegant solutions are often the simplest, powered not by complex machinery, but by the quiet, inexorable forces of nature itself. If this story of forgotten ingenuity and quiet persistence resonated with you, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you do not miss our next dive into the lost arts of historical engineering and survival. It is stories like this that remind us that we have more to learn from the past than we often realize. And now, my question to you is this: what modern convenience in your life could you potentially replace with a simple, passive system like the one Josiah built? Whether it is for cooling, heating, or something else entirely, let us discuss the possibilities of applying this old wisdom to our new world in the comments below. I look forward to reading your ideas. Disclaimer: this telling is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. The characters and specific events depicted are products of imagination. However, the underlying technical principles of ice harvesting, ice house construction, insulation with natural materials like sawdust, and passive cooling through thermal convection are based on real historical practices from the 19th century and are consistent with the laws of physics. The application of any historical building technique in a modern context must be done with extreme caution. It is essential to consult with qualified professional engineers and architects, and to ensure full compliance with all current local, state, and federal building codes, safety regulations, and environmental laws. Do not attempt to construct or inhabit any structure based solely on this or any other historical narrative.